Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Veg Grower Podcast. My name's Richard and I want to encourage and inspire you to grow more of your own food. And I do this by sharing exactly what I've been up to in my own allotment and my own garden. Now this week I'm starting off in my shed here at home because it is time for our seed of the month. And this month I want to talk about tomatoes. Now tomatoes are probably one of the most commonly grown crops I know vegetable gardeners will do. They're certainly one of the most rewarding crops to grow. A fresh, sun-ripened tomato is worlds apart from anything you can buy from a supermarket. In fact, many people that I know who grow their own food often say that supermarket tomatoes taste like cotton wool. How they know what cotton wool tastes like, I never know. But I get the point. They do taste pretty awful when we grow our own. Now, something I've noticed with tomatoes is that they are very, very commonly grown. And they're sort of chosen because they're thought to be easy. I personally don't think they are necessarily an easy plant to grow because they do herald, their heritage comes from some much warmer climates than what we have here in the UK. But they are commonly grown. Now there's lots of different types of tomatoes. There's over 10,000 varieties to choose from. And, you know, the list of varieties does come down to what we really want from them. So first of all, we have some cherry tomatoes. These are a snackable favourite. And I often do try and grow cherry tomatoes. They're sweet, they're small, and you can pick them straight off the vine and eat them. Some varieties of these are Sun Gold, Gardener's Delight, or Black Cherry. And what I often do with cherry tomatoes, yes, I will grow them in the ground or in the greenhouse up against canes, depending if they're indeterminate or determinate. But they can also grow in hanging baskets or containers because they're not huge plants, but they're a nice sized plant and they can actually grow as tumbling tomatoes, which means they avoid blight. Now, back in January, I actually sowed a variety of tomatoes called Minibel. Now, these are a bush dwarfing tomato. They grow very, very small, so they are ideal for some small spaces, and I've got lots of them at the moment. We're going to be growing those in pots in various locations, but I've also got one in my hydroponic system, which is doing fantastic at the moment. Far, far better than any of the others. But the reason I've chosen these is because they are a dwarf variety, so they don't grow huge and they can still provide us with some half decent tomatoes. Now I have to admit, Minibel, I don't like the skin. I find the skin to be quite thick. But other than that, they're a nice dwarf tomato, so they will only probably get to about 30 centimetres tall, so they should stay pretty compact. Now moving on from that, we have plum and grape tomatoes. These are ideal for cooking. They've got a really nice flavour. They're usually more oblong in shape. Often when you buy a tin of tomatoes, that is plum tomatoes that are used in that. And some of the popular varieties, Roma, San Marzano and Aperitif, just to name a few. And these types of tomatoes are brilliant for making some homemade tomato sauce, passata, or even making into sun-dried tomatoes. And then, of course, we have beefsteak tomatoes. These are the big, juicy tomatoes, often used in sandwiches. They get really big. And some of my favourite ones of these include Brandywine, Marmond, and Cherokee Purple, which are slightly different colour, not the standard red colour that we expect with tomatoes. And finally, we, of course, have our salad and slicing tomatoes. These are your standard tomatoes that we use every day. Again, they can be used in sandwiches, but if you are only able to grow one particular type of tomatoes, then we want to look at something like these. These come down to Elisa Craig, Moneymaker, Tigerilla, which is a beautiful looking tomato, I have to say. Got yellow stripes on them, which makes them look absolutely stunning. Now, added to that, we do also have some unusual heirloom varieties, such as Green Zebra, Indigo Rose, to name a few. But something I always try and grow, particularly outside, is some blight-resistant tomatoes as well. And these could be a variety that just stand up to the blight resistance, such as Crimson Crush, Mountain Magic, and Lizano. Now again, I've listed all these varieties with links to various websites in the show notes if you are looking to buy any of these. Now, when it comes to growing tomatoes from seed, the best time to sow tomatoes is from January to early April. But what I would say, I wait until March for most of mine. I find that if we sow them in January, the exception being these dwarf tomatoes, what tends to happen is they grow too big and we run out of space to continue growing them by about now. And really, unless you've got a heated greenhouse, really it's too cold at the moment to get them into the greenhouse. In a couple of weeks' time it will be fine, but at the moment the greenhouse is just a little bit too cold, so it's a little bit too early to get them in the greenhouse just yet. But if you have a heated propagator or indoor setup, you can start them as early as January or February, but certainly for outdoor growing, we're looking March to early April, which just gives the plants enough time to mature and get big enough before they can go outside ready for the summer. Now, I tend to sow all my tomato seeds in seed trays. These are root trainers that I fill up with seed compost, and I've added in some perlite. I've spoken about this many times before. I just fill them up, put one seed per root trainer, and then place those in my heated propagator. If you haven't got a heated propagator, don't worry. A warm windowsill will do just as well. And don't forget to label. Labelling is so important because you will never remember what seeds are where. And I always actually write my labels out before I sow the seeds. What I do when I plant out my seeds is I just prick a hole about 5 mil deep, half a centimetre deep, and then just drop a single seed in there, cover it over and water. Now I tend to water from the bottom, so I place my plug plants in a tray and let the water soak up from the bottom. I keep that between 18 to 22 degrees C, sunny windowsill, or even an airing cupboard. As soon as they germinate, which can take 5 to 10 days, depending on the temperature and how good the seeds are, then we need to move these somewhere where they get plenty of light. Light is really important, but make sure they don't get cold at the same time. Now, because I'm growing these in plug plants, I don't tend to pot on until all the compost is used up, until the roots in the plug plant is fully used up. However, if you've done a different way where you may sow them into trays, you will probably want to start pricking out as soon as you start to see true leaves, and you just pop them up into bigger and bigger pots. Keep them somewhere warm and bright, and just keep an eye and make sure they don't run out of space in the pots. As I said, by about mid-March I will start looking at getting my tomato plants into the greenhouse, and then we can start looking at getting them outside, just gradually hardening them off, getting them used to being outside. Now, when we harden off, one thing we always think about, yes, temperature and also light, very important, but also wind. When we put our plants outside, if they're not strong plants and a gentle breeze comes along, it can blow over a plant. So what I like to do, as the plants are growing, about once a day, I will just go along and brush all the plants over with my fingers, just to act like a wind, and that just helps the plants grow a little bit stronger. Now, I won't actually plant any of my tomato plants outside until mid-May, so there's quite a long time before they are ready. And if they're going outside, they obviously go straight in the ground. Just make sure the ground has got plenty of weeds removed and plenty of organic matter straight in the ground, and obviously with support if needed. Of course, we can also grow them in pots, in patios, or in grow bags. I'm not a lover of grow bags, but they are certainly something that we could use. Hydroponics is another option, or inside my greenhouse is something that I'm doing as well. Inside my autopot system, which I've set up, I've got 4-pot system in my greenhouse now. That's set up, so we'll have some tomatoes in there, as well as my 2-pot systems, the smaller ones, set up in my greenhouse as well. So we've got plenty of room in that greenhouse to grow lots and lots of plants. Now, tomatoes do need lots of sunlight. They love heat. They do come from warmer climates. They need sort of between 6 to 8 hours of sunlight at least. A direct sunlight at that, so it needs to be in full sun for most of the day. Well-draining soil is a must as well. They don't really like getting overly wet, so plenty of organic matter added to the soil. And then we want to give them about 45 to 60 centimetres of space between all plants. And this should, in theory, give them good airflow, which helps prevent disease. Now, when it comes to support and training tomatoes, it does depend on the variety because there's two different types of tomatoes. We got bush types or determinate, and they don't need staking, but they do benefit from a small cage or something, or just a bit of support. You also have vining types, which are most commonly known. These are indeterminate, and they do need canes and they need staking quite regularly. And now, the thing is, the indeterminate plants also, they produce little shoots in between their branches, and they need pricking out. This is so they focus more of their energy on fruit production as they grow. So that's something else to think about as well. Bush types also, they only grow to a certain height and they won't grow any taller. The vining types, the indeterminate, will continue to grow. Now, one of the important things when it comes to tomatoes is making sure that they are consistently watering. They don't like too much water because that can lead to split fruit or blossom end rot. But of course, not enough water can cause other problems as well. Water at the base, not on the leaves, around the soil, and also add a mulch around your plants to retain the moisture. Then once the flowers appear, we want to feed with a high potash fertiliser. Comfrey tea is a good alternative, but the well-known one is, of course, tomato feed. Ideally every 7 days, depending on how strong a mix you give it. Now, one of the biggest problems that I tend to have with my tomatoes is blight. I get it every year. That's why I tend to grow blight-resistant tomatoes. Now, well-spaced plants with plenty of airflow does help with this, and watering at the base as well. However, other ways of avoiding blight is to use things like blight-resistant varieties, Crimson Crush, Mountain Magic, already mentioned, or another alternative is JBA Blight Guard, and you spray this on before you get blight and you'll never get blight. One of the other problems is blossom end rot, and this is often caused by a calcium deficiency from irregular watering. So keep your watering steady and consistent. I've already mentioned that, and that's very, very important. Split fruit can also happen. This happens when a plant is watered too much and then dries out. So again, regular watering. As easy as that. Tomatoes are pretty easy. As I said, we've just got to make sure they get plenty of sun and they are consistently watered. Now, if you've got a variety of tomato that you absolutely love growing, let me know what it is. I'm going to head on down to the allotment. In the meantime, let's find out what's been going on in the Supporters Club this week. Well, I hope you're enjoying this podcast so far. If you are, then please rate and review on your podcast provider. It only takes you a few seconds, but it really lifts us up through the charts and get us found by more people who might be interested in how to grow their own food. Now, not only that, we also run the Supporters Club, which is set up to keep the wheels on this podcast running. It means when things get in our way, this podcast will keep running. And that's what it's set up for, not to make money, but to keep the podcast running. To be a member costs just £5 a month, but for that you get access to extra behind the scenes podcasts that give you a bit more idea of what we're doing here at the Veg Grower Podcast HQ. Added to that, you also get a seed pack through your door once a month, and that seed contains a collection of seeds that can be sown in that very month that have been carefully curated by myself, and you also get a copy of our mini newspaper. Now, over this last week, we haven't sown any seeds because I normally send out 6 packs of seeds every month, and we had sown them all up by the end of last week. Instead, I've been sharing what seeds I'm sending out in March. I always send the next month's seeds out at the very last day of the month, so they will be arriving through people's letterbox as we speak. And this month, we are sending out a good collection. We've got some tomatoes as seed of the month, as you would expect. We've got some chives, a lovely herb. I always try and include a herb. We've also got some lettuce, some spinach, some carrots, some spring onions, all of which we're going to be sowing throughout March. Now, if that is something you would be interested in signing up to, then please head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk to find out more and sign up. We'll be happy to have you there. Right, let's get back to the gardening. Well, I'm down on the allotment now, and what with the weather starting to warm up, this weekend the weather has been absolutely glorious, I have to say. Still a little bit of a chill in the air, but the sun has been shining, and it means that the allotment is starting to wake up. It's also March, and that means that the allotment really is going to start ramping up with all the tasks that we need to do throughout this month. Now, I said there's a chill in the air. It's nice and warm when the sun hits you on the back, but overnight those temperatures can still be a little cold. So what I recommend that we all do is just keep an eye on the weather forecast and just see how that is going to affect our plants. If it's going to be a bit of a chill in the air, a bit cold, we might have to protect any plants that we have on our allotment with a bit of fleece. Now, I have a clay soil on this allotment, which does take a long time to warm up. And that is in part why early beds have covered over with a weed suppressor membrane, a black membrane, in order to warm the soil up. But if we're going to be looking at other areas, we may want to put some cloches over to warm the soil up as well. Now, preparing the soil is something that is going to be a top priority throughout this month. As a no-dig gardener, I have spent a lot of the winter months covering over my beds with cardboard in order to reduce the amount of weeds. And it pays off because the weeds are not coming back in those areas as fast as they would. But all these beds are going to need a good covering of good quality compost. Ideally our own homemade compost. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough, so we might have to get hold of some more compost in order to continue growing these. Of course, we could sow some green manures to help with that. There's still plenty of time for that. But another option, which isn't what I'm going to do, is of course finish off digging over our soil, adding well-rotted manure compost, forking over the soil and peeling back the mulch to let the soil breathe. Not my preferred way, of course, as a no-digger. I tend to like to just throw compost on top of the soil. Now, throughout March we can start sowing and planting. As I said, the soil might still be cold, and a soil thermometer is a worthwhile investment and not much money, easy to get hold of, and they just tell you how warm your soil is and whether that's going to be good enough for planting seeds directly in the soil. Now, I tend not to direct plant many seeds, but there are a couple of exceptions. Carrots and parsnips are two that I sow directly because they do not like disturbing. Now, down on the allotment, the soil may not be warm enough. So what we will have to do in these areas is cover over with a good cloche in order to warm up the soil, and then we can start sowing our carrots and parsnips. Now, parsnips are one that I find that do struggle when the soil is cold. I tend to hold off sowing any parsnips until probably May, but this year I'm going to give it a try and warm up the beds beforehand with a good cloche. Beetroot and radish are also two quick growing crops, perfect for early harvests. Well worth sowing directly as well. Spinach and chard, I've actually started some of these off at home, but we can directly sow those into the ground. And peas. Now, peas are one that we can sow directly into the ground. Personally, what I like to do is start mine off in root trainers of compost, or what you could do is a piece of guttering filled with multi-purpose compost and just simply slide that into place. And then, of course, broad beans. Now, I've overwintered a load of broad beans. I need to get those in the ground. But I tend to only grow overwintered broad beans. But if we wanted spring planted broad beans, we can sow those directly in the ground as well. The thing we've got to remember is just keep an eye on the weather. Keep an eye whether we need to protect our seedlings as to whether or not we sow these directly. Now, indoors, where we can start off a lot more seeds. Tomatoes and peppers are good options. Brassicas, of course, cabbage, cauliflowers, Brussels sprouts, lettuce and salad leaves. These can all be started off indoors and transplanted at a later date. But keep an eye on the weather is the main thing when it comes to seed sowing. In all honesty, a lot of seeds, if you do not have indoor space, it's worth just holding off for another month before we start sowing those. Now, pruning and tidying up is a big job throughout March because everything starts springing into life. And pruning we've done a lot of that over the winter, but it's well worth just walking around and just making sure that everything is finally done. Our fruit trees and bushes, if they haven't been pruned yet, just finish off the pruning. Raspberry canes are a good one to finish off. So now summer varieties, last year's growth should be tied in with the years before pruned back to ground level. And then of course our autumn varieties, if you haven't done it yet, it's the last chance to really cut down your autumn variety of raspberry canes right down to the ground, and then they will produce raspberries later on in their season. One thing as well when it comes to tidying up, now because we've done a lot of the infrastructure work here over the winter months, we can really start concentrating on weeding. Now weeding is one of those jobs I think everybody hates, but it is a necessary job. Now, I start a new job this week, and I'm hoping that every evening on my way home I'm going to be able to stop off at the allotment and do a bit of weeding just for 15-20 minutes, and that in theory should mean that I will be on top of my weeding. Added to that, what I will also do is just start in the same bed each time. And I find that this is a good way of really getting on top of a weed. So what I mean by that is I'll start in, say, bed 1. I will weed that completely. When that bed is weeded completely, I can then move on to bed 2. Now that may mean that on the first day you end up concentrating in only one bed, but if you come on the following day, you go to bed 1, that might only take a matter of minutes, and then you can move on to bed 2. The following day, again, you start in bed 1, may take minutes. Bed 2 may take minutes. You're then on to bed 3, and you keep that up right throughout the growing season. It really does help with keeping on top of the weeds. Now, it was also the chance that we can start planting out a lot of plants as well throughout the month, particularly towards the second half of the month. Things like potatoes and onions can go into the ground, provided of course they are warm enough. Now my potatoes, I generally pop mine in around St Patrick's Day, which is around the middle of March, the later half of March, and I just get them all into the ground in one go. The correct way to do it, however, is put your first earlies in 1 week, your second earlies the following week, and your main crops the week after. And easy to do. I've prepared the soil by making sure all the beds are warmed up by placing weed suppressant membrane, but we'll peel back the beds, we'll remove any weeds, and then we'll just plant our potatoes in about 10 to 15 centimetres deep, give it about 30 centimetres of space, and then cover them over. As they grow, of course, we will make sure that we add more compost. But something we do need to do when we plant out our potatoes, of course, keep an eye on the weather, because we may need to cover those over with a bit of fleece in order to retain some of the heat. Now onion sets, shallots and garlic can also go in as well. I've got a lot of overwintered onion sets that I've done something a bit different with this year. I've got some in the ground already, but the rest I've started off in my greenhouse at home in my root trainers just to give them a good early start. And they will then start going into the ground as we go on throughout the March. Now, those are the overwintered ones, but of course if you want spring sown onion sets as well, this is a time that you can start doing that too. Or if you're like me, I've started a lot of onions off from seed, and we've pricked those out. We're getting them to continue to grow. They will soon start going into the ground as well. Shallots and garlic fall into the same sort of situation as well. We do grow a lot of shallots, we do grow a lot of garlic, and this year we're hoping to be really, really successful with both of these. Now, one of the big things that I like to do throughout March as well is to help out our wildlife. You can probably hear that birds are starting to tweet in the background as they start to come out of their winter nests, their hibernation. And this means they're going to be hungry. So putting up some bird feeders and feeding them is a good thing to do. But that also means they will be actively hunting down slugs and snails for us as well. So, it works on two levels. Added to that, there are going to be some pollinating insects looking for flowers, maybe daffodils, maybe primroses, maybe even some rosemary flowers as well. Again, making sure they're available just helps ensure that those pollinators are going to be in, and they're going to keep coming back throughout the year in order to pollinate our own fruits. And of course, putting up bug hotels, that is great for bees, gives them a home, but also other bugs that we might need, and things like hedgehogs and frogs and toads that also going to help keep that slug population down. Everything helps, in my opinion, and the more we can do to help our wildlife, the more they're going to help us out throughout the year. Well, as it's starting to get a bit noisier down here, more and more people are coming out of their winter hibernation to visit their allotments as well. But I think it is time to head on home, and that is my to-do list for the allotment throughout March. It's going to keep us very, very busy, but I'm pleased to say, because we've done the infrastructure work over winter, we are really ready to go. Right, I will meet you back at home, back in the podding shed, and I'm going to talk to you about the book of the month.
Chopping all the veggies, sizzle in the air. Chef Scott with the magic, smells are everywhere. Water starts to boil, onions hit the pan. Recipe of the week, let the feast begin. Cooking with Chef Scott, flavors come alive. Tune in every week for a tasty bite.
Hi, it's Scott here with this week's recipe. And with us being in forced rhubarb season, I thought I'd share a recipe using it. And I love rhubarb because it's so versatile and works well in savoury dishes. And one of my favourite flavour combinations is pork and rhubarb. They go so well together. And this recipe, a pork and rhubarb tray bake, is a simple way to enjoy these flavours. So let's head to the kitchen and hear how it's made. As usual, you can find this recipe and others on the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk and on my Instagram page, Seed to Table Plot 13. This recipe serves 4 and you will need 4 thick cut pork chops, 300 grams of rhubarb sliced into inch long batons, 200 grams of red onions cut into quarters, 10 grams of sliced fresh ginger, 3 star anise, 50 grams of honey, 60 grams of light soy sauce, the juice and zest of 1 clementine, and 200 grams of purple sprouting broccoli. Method: combine the onions, broccoli, ginger, honey, soy, star anise, and the juice and zest of the clementine in a mixing bowl and toss to combine, and transfer to a roasting dish and roast in a preheated oven set at 200 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes. Whilst this is happening, in a hot frying pan, seal and colour the pork chops for 2 minutes on each side until golden brown. Now add these along with the rhubarb to the roasting tray and roast for a further 15 minutes. Serve with rice or potatoes, and that's the recipe done, and that's it from me this week.
Well, we are coming to the end of this week's podcast, and I hope you've enjoyed it as always. Now, throughout February, our book of the month has been The Jam Maker's Garden by Holly Farrell with photographs by Jason Ingram. This is a book I got from the library. And I've been reading it throughout February, and I've got to admit, I found it a rather interesting book. It's not your typical gardening book, and it's not your typical recipe book. The way I think I could describe it is a recipe book that also talks about growing the plants that we need, or growing the fruits that we need to make the jams. And for me, this was a really interesting take because it just gave a different sort of light to what we do. As we are all keen veg growers, I'm sure the whole idea of this book is something that we would really like, because at the end of the day, we grow food to eat. We don't grow food because it looks pretty, although that is a bit of an advantage. We grow food because we want to eat it. Now, as I'm reading through this book, and one of the many things I noticed right at the very beginning, it talks about setting up your garden, how to add compost, and all the standard things you would expect at the beginning of any gardening book, kitchen garden design and things like that. But it also talks about fruit trees and all the various plants and tools that we may need to be fruit gardeners. Not only fruit gardeners, it also does talk a bit about other plants. I mean, tomatoes are probably a fruit that we don't really think about when it comes to talking about fruit gardens. And even things like making paper pots. Now, at the heart of this book and the way this book was set up is the section called From the Fruit Garden. And basically it starts off with how to grow a certain fruit, maybe strawberries, maybe gooseberries. And then it comes up with several different preserves that we can do using those recipes. So strawberries, strawberry jam is the first recipe, which I think is pretty standard. Talks about how to improve the pectin in strawberries and things like that, things that we would need to know. Going on to gooseberries, we've got gooseberry jam. Then we've got gooseberry cheese, something a little bit different. Red currants, and I'm flicking through the book and reading them out to you. Red currant jelly, and barley duck. Never heard of that, but that's something that sounds quite interesting. But you get the idea. It has got recipes, it has got fruit gardening, and overall a very, very good book. It's not one I would rush out and buy, however. It's certainly worth a read if you find it at your local library, and it's certainly one that I have enjoyed reading, and I honestly can say now I'm excited to get stuck into my allotment, stuck into my fruit garden here at home and grow these fruits. Now, our book of the month has been sent in to me by a listener called Gary. Thank you very much, Gary, for this book. It's called Allotted Time, 12 months, 2 blokes, 1 shed and no idea. And as I understand it, as Gary said to me, I haven't read this book yet, of course, but Gary sent it to me after talking about mental health. And Gary said that he found this book a really good way, a really good insight into how gardening has helped people with mental health. So it's written by Robin Shelton, so I'm looking forward to seeing how this book turns out. I'll be reading it throughout March, and I'll report to you at the end of March and see how it is. Well, that brings us up to the end of this week's podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please do leave us a rating and review on your podcast provider. Only takes a few seconds, but it means the world to us. Unfortunately, I can't check Spotify at the moment, but I will report back next week if we've got any reviews on there. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you want to help support the work that we do, then please become a member of our supporters club. That's very much appreciated. Details on that at theveggrowpodcast.co.uk. While you're on our website, don't forget you can leave us a comment on the bottom of a blog post, or you can leave us a voicemail using our voicemail function. And of course, don't forget you can send me an email. richard@theveggrowpodcast.co.uk is my email address. And finally, don't forget you can find me on social media. We're on pretty much every platform under the Veg Grower Podcast. We will be back again next time, so until then, please take care.